When South Carolina announced its secession, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated president in the early part of 1861, and when he came to Washington, it had to be done with a great deal of stealth because there was fear of rioters in the streets who had pledged to kill Lincoln. He got to Washington, made his inaugural speech, and said that, quote, combinations too powerful to suppress by ordinary means, unquote, had arisen against the authority of the government in the South, and he called for 90-day volunteers to come to the federal colors and put down the rebellion. Well, when Lincoln called for troops, a number of other southern states who were teetering on the brink went over into secession. The theorists behind the Southern cause were Jefferson Davis, the former Secretary of War in Pierce's administration, and Judah P. Benjamin, one of the most unusual people in American history, a brilliant man. He was from New Orleans, where he was engaged in business and was an attorney. He was a very, very powerful man. And he was Davis's brain. He came up with a theory of a unified Southern Confederacy, which would take all 15 of the slave states in. And with the 15 slave states all as part of the Confederacy would have more territory than the Union, would extend north all the way to the Ohio River as a defense line, would be virtually half as big as Europe and almost impossible to attack independence almost by default. Unfortunately for Davis and Benjamin, not all the slave states seceded. 11 of them did, but 4 slave states remained in the Union, either by cajoling by Lincoln, by a combination of local events, and sometimes by federal military force. The 4 were Maryland, which was especially important because it controlled the route to Washington, D.C., and if Maryland had seceded, Washington would have been surrounded by Confederate territory, just as they intended in the original Constitution, remember? Secondly, Delaware, which was a very small state, but still a slave state at this time, not terribly important. Kentucky, which was enormously important because Kentucky contains not only the defense line of the Ohio River, but also the mountains behind it. And with Kentucky in the Confederacy, a Union attack on the Western Confederacy would have been very much more difficult. And fourthly, Missouri, also important because it was the flank of the Confederacy, so to speak. Missouri was kept in the Union largely by force of federal arms. Kentucky originally decided to be neutral and issued a proclamation of neutrality between the two sides, as if one could possibly be neutral. Either you were Union or you were Confederate. How could you be neutral? But Kentucky attempted to be neutral originally, and when the Confederates attempted to set up their defense line, the Confederate Army moved into Kentucky. Then the governor of Kentucky said Kentucky will stay in the Union and asked for Union troops to keep the invaders out. So the military situation determined Kentucky. And Lincoln himself had a great deal to do with keeping Maryland in the Union. Also the fact that federal troops were posted in Baltimore to put down the rioters there. And if you read the old songs, leaf through the old songs, you'll find Maryland, my Maryland, to the tune of Tannenbaum, oh Maryland, my Maryland, da-da-da-da. Well, it talks about the tyrant with his heel on Maryland's throat. The tyrant in that song is Lincoln, because the Southerners viewed Maryland as being suppressed by the North and kept in the Union by force. There was a good deal of Union sentiment, however, in Maryland, and it really wasn't true. When the Confederate troops invaded Maryland, they found that the citizens there were not anxious to rise for the Confederacy. Anyway, those 4 slave states stayed in the Union, and it made an enormous difference in the war. The 90-day volunteers were about to have their terms expire with nothing done, and so a battle was fought, mainly for political reasons, in Virginia early in 1861, the Battle of Manassas, or First Manassas. And while the Union thought it had won a victory, it turned out that by the end of the day, it was a Confederate rout. There were 2 things that were important about that battle. First, it demonstrated that this was not going to be an easy, simple war, that, in fact, this was not going to be over in 90 days. Secondly, and this is the most important thing, the battle was fought to protect a junction between 2 railroad lines, and the battle was won by troops arriving on the field by rail during the battle. This was completely different from any previous war. There had never been a war in which railroads were the determining factor, as they were in the American Civil War, to an enormous degree. This is one of the many reasons why the American Civil War is considered the first modern war, because it was the first one in which the enormous capacity of transport and that rails offered, and the speed at which rails could move troops and goods from one place to another, took great effect. All the major wars from the Civil War down through World War II have essentially been railroad wars. In the future, who knows? But it was the enormous capacity for movement of troops and goods that made those wars so enormously destructive and accounted for those huge casualty lists. In the past, the only way to get troops from one place to another was to march them there. But now, the speed at which troops could be concentrated and the ability to supply them in large numbers of troops in huge armies over long distances, over long periods of time, existed that did not exist previously. And that's an extremely important factor in the American Civil War. Remember also that when the southern states seceded, they took their representatives in Congress with them. And instead of now having a strong southern contingent supporting a low tariff and preventing northern attempts to build internal improvements, raise the tariff, and carry out a northern economic program, all those oppositions were gone. And so during the course of the Civil War, some enormously important legislation was passed, things that you don't forget, that you don't remember. The Republican Party was not only an anti-slavery party, it also had a northern economic program tailored to people of the North, particularly the business classes of the North. The Republican Party has been the party of business ever since it was first founded. One of the first things it did was to establish a very high tariff on foreign goods coming into the United States for the benefit of northern manufacturers, number one. Number two, for the northern consumers, it offered free land in the West, the so-called Homestead Act. Anybody who wanted to go west could stake out a piece of property, 40 acres, build a house on it, live on it for 5 years, and the property would belong to him. And this was an enormously exhilarating piece of legislation, even though comparatively few people homesteaded successfully, as it turned out. But it offered the idea of free land in the West for anybody who wanted to go there. What an enormous sense of liberty that must have granted. Thirdly, the Land Grant College Act was passed. The states were given large chunks of federal land that they could sell and raise money to promote colleges which would promote agriculture, engineering, and military science. The first of them was Michigan State. Today we have many of them. They're all known these days as state universities. Generally, if you have a university of something and you have a something state, the state often was an agriculture, mineral college, land grant college proposed by the federal government. But this support for the colleges enormously increased the available opportunities for education and for research in agriculture and mechanical engineering. And fourthly, the federal government passed the Pacific Railroad Act, which allowed for huge federal subsidies for the construction of a railroad to the Pacific to begin, as Lincoln himself determined, opposite Council Bluffs, Iowa, at the town of Omaha, Nebraska, on the Missouri River. Now, comparatively little building was done during the war, but after the war, the Pacific Railroad was completed within 4 years after the end of the Civil War, and it was an enormous landmark in the conquest of the continent. Imagine if the Confederacy had won the war, you probably would have had a Confederate Pacific Railroad starting in New Orleans. But since the North won, you have the Union Pacific Railroad, today still one of the biggest and richest corporations in America. The Union Pacific, founded by the Republican Party in 1862. The war, while it was physically disastrous for the South, which was, of course, the scene of most of the fighting and suffered most of the damage, was also financially exhilarating for the North. Huge amounts of money were poured into the northern economy because the North made a conscious decision not to raise taxes too high during the war to pay for the war. Rather, money was borrowed, largely from European sources, to support the war effort. The theory being that future generations should help pay for the war as well. What happens when you borrow huge amounts of money and invest it in your economy? Your economy grows by leaps and bounds. And with wartime demand for clothes, for food, to support the soldiers, for munitions, for iron, for, and later, and shortly after the war, for steel, particularly iron at that time. Huge amounts of money poured into the economy. Industrial development was speeded up. Coal mines were opened. New wheat fields were opened. Copper mines were opened. Huge economic development in the North as a result, directly a result of the war. Andrew Jackson, back in 1836, had not believed in federal banking, right? And one of the things he did was to balance the federal budget. The result was a terrible depression in 1837. The North, during the Civil War, unbalanced the federal budget to a degree which had never been seen before, and the result was enormous prosperity for several years. One of the effects of economic history in our country is that you've got to look back and realize that when you spend more money than the government takes in and invest money in the economy, the result is not disaster, but expansion. And that's why you should never have a balanced budget. History tells us you should never have a balanced budget. A balanced budget is a formula for economic stagnation and possibly for recession. That also was one of the lessons of the American Civil War, if you go back to read it. The war lasted 4 long years. And when it ended with a total Union triumph, the North, which had gone into the war not that apparently much stronger than the South, although it did have a huge advantage in population and industry even at the beginning, was immeasurably stronger at the end of the war. The South lost everything. It lost its system of labor, slavery having been abolished by proclamation during the war and by constitutional amendment at the end of the war. And it also lost much of its cotton crop, much of its ability to sell abroad because the tariff was raised. In other words, the South was a loser in many ways. And the Civil War impoverished the South for 100 years to come. It was lagged far behind the rest of the country and still does, even with this booming Sun Belt economy. Overall, the South is still the poorest section of the country. Another thing that happened as a result of the war was that the steamboat trade down the Mississippi, which had been healthy even despite the railroads right down to the beginning of the war, virtually never recovered. The Mississippi is still an artery of commerce, but nowhere near what it was before. And relatively, the city of New Orleans has never recovered its strength comparatively. Neither does Charleston, which before the war was a great port, and today is a relatively minor port, a relatively minor city. The long-term impact of the war was to enormously increase the wealth and power of the North and impoverish and isolate the South to a greater degree than ever. At the end of the war, the country entered into what was called the Reconstruction period. That's rather a euphemism because it wasn't so much a reconstruction as it was, my goodness, squabbling over control of resources. At the end of the war, the Republican Party, which had fought the war successfully, was regarded by the North as the party of truth, justice, and the American way. As somebody said, every soldier who fired a bullet against a Northern soldier in the war was a Democrat. And the Democratic Party was looked at in great disgrace by the upper classes in the North for the most part. There were Northern Democrats. There were a lot of them. In the West, there were a lot of them, and the Irish immigrants in New York City became Democrats because they opposed the military draft during the war. They didn't want to fight the South for the behalf of the Negro. They saw no reason to do this. They were competing with the Negro economically, and they didn't like the military draft and didn't see any reason why they should fight. But outside of the immigrant groups and some people in the West in the lower classes, the Republican Party was the party of truth, justice, and the American way in the North. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the period of unbridled greed known as the Gilded Age after the war, tremendous amounts of money were made, tremendous amounts of money were stolen. New investments were made in the South. The Southern iron industry was developed. The Northern iron industry became bigger and bigger and became a steel industry as well. And the North began to develop the characteristics of the modern society to even a greater degree. Well, even while the Civil War was still on, there was consideration to what to do when, at the end of the war, when the North had won, how to restore the South to the Union and how to reconstruct the South. Lincoln had his own idea, and he proposed a plan in which if 10% of the voters, just 10% of the voters in the Confederate States would take an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and agree to support the laws, that the state could be readmitted with its own government into the Union. But Lincoln's plan was attacked by the radical Republicans in Congress, and you can understand why they did that. First of all, they were concerned that the war would not prove anything. All this blood and treasure would have been spilled for nothing if the Southern states were admitted too easily. They wanted to make sweeping changes, social reforms in the South that would guarantee that the South would not be to the country again what it had been before the war, a block to the Northern progress, to the Northern economic program. And especially they wanted to do something about the condition of the blacks in the South. They wanted to make sure that slavery would not be restored in any form, and they wanted to make sure that the Republican Party, their own party, would politically benefit from any Reconstruction plan. So they attempted to pass a bill, the Wade-Davis Act, which would have forced abolished slavery and would have forced black suffrage, Negro suffrage in the South, Lincoln killed that bill with a pocket veto and explained why he was not in favor of it. He said it was too severe, and his object of the war aim was to put the South back into the Union, to restore the Union. So Lincoln's plan might be called the 10% restoration plan. The radical Republicans wanted something much more violent. Well, when Lincoln was shot to death in 1865, he was succeeded by Andrew Johnson as president. This happens to be one of the most unfortunate presidential successions ever. Johnson was put on the ticket in 1864 only because the Lincoln people were so concerned about losing the 1864 election. It's hard for people today to realize that Lincoln very nearly was not reelected, and for a while was so sure he wouldn't be reelected that he actually sat down and wrote a memo of how to handle the government in the time that between the election and the inauguration, because he was so sure that he wouldn't be reelected for a second term. In fact, it was for some time there was even doubt that he'd get the Republican Party nomination for a second term. So unpopular was the war in the early part of 1864. You can understand that when you realize that in the month of May of 1864, the Army of the Potomac alone, Grant's army alone, suffered 50,000 casualties in a month, and still could not subdue the Confederates. The enormous casualty toll was coming in. It was something like Vietnam, except much worse in the sense that the huge casualty figures were coming in and no apparent progress was being made. So Lincoln was very concerned about re-election. Later in that year, Mobile Bay in August of 1864, the capture of Atlanta in September of 1864, and the huge vote in favor of pursuing the war from the soldiers did indeed re-elect Lincoln with a comfortable majority. But during the summer of 1864, the Republican Party was very worried that Lincoln would not be reelected. And so to strengthen his chances, the Republicans renamed themselves, and they called themselves the Union Party, and they put on the ticket, they dumped Lincoln's vice president, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, and instead they substituted for Hamlin Andrew Johnson of Tennessee as the vice presidential candidate. Now, Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. He was a Southerner from Tennessee, and he had been if I'm not mistaken, senator from Tennessee or governor of the state. Not at all an educated man. He had been a tailor and made his own clothes, and was given to fits of intemperance, shall we say, sometimes at the wrong time. Also had very little tact. He was a very blunt man, a self-made man, and not exactly the ideal person to handle a difficult political situation. But of course, they thought he was going to be on the ticket simply to help win the election. Nobody ever thought that he was going to be president in 1864. But in 1865, when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln, Andrew Johnson became president. This was a terrible thing to happen at this particular moment, because not only was Johnson a Southerner and a Democrat, he had to face a Republican Congress that was very much more radical than even Lincoln had been. And they did not get along well with him, and they were suspicious of him. They thought he was really an unreconstructed Confederate, seeing as he was from the South in the first place. And Johnson had unfortunately gotten drunk at the wrong time during his inauguration and did not make a good impression on the Congress that way. So when Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson attempted to put forth Lincoln's 10% plan while Congress was out of session. And he actually admitted some of the southern state governments on his own recognition in the period between the end of the hostilities in April of 1865 and the meeting of the Congress that fall. The congressional Republicans, the radical Republicans, absolutely were furious, and they wouldn't stand for this. They refused to seat the Confederate representatives, and the southern states that did come in at that point, and did attempt to come back into the Union, also made a tactical mistake in passing what they called the Black Codes, which were codes to organize the freedmen, the blacks were at that point called the freedmen, for labor purposes. And it said that if you were a black person, you had to make a labor contract, and if you were idle, if you did not have a contract, the state would seize you and make one for you. And to the Northerners, it looked very much as if slavery was just being continued in another form. And the Republicans said, for this we fought the war and suffered 400,000 casualties. We'll have none of it. So the Radical Reconstruction Radical Reconstruction Congress refused to accept the states under Johnson's 10% plan, and instead passed bills to a second Reconstruction plan, which would have made it much harder for the Confederates to be readmitted to the Union. Johnston vetoed everything they passed, which simply made them madder than ever at him. And in the congressional elections of 1866, the Radicals and their allies won a total victory. They now had 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress, which meant that they could override anything Johnson vetoed. And beginning in 1866, they tried to conduct a congressional Reconstruction. In order for the Southern states to be admitted, anyone who had fought for the Confederacy was disenfranchised in the first place, and that meant virtually all the white male population of the South. Secondly, the Southern states had to accept the 14th Amendment. The 13th had ended slavery. The 14th granted citizenship and civil rights to Southern blacks. They had to ratify the 14th Amendment, and also all those former Confederate states had to repudiate the Confederate war debt, which was indeed part of the 14th Amendment. If you read it today, the repudiation of the Confederate war debt is in there. And they had to accept Negro suffrage. Well, this was a very, very bitter pill. Johnson attempted to veto the congressional legislation. They passed everything over his veto. And so, beginning with 1866, what we now call Reconstruction, really the third Reconstruction, Congressional Radical Reconstruction, went into effect. The South was treated as conquered provinces. Military forces were stationed in the South to enforce the laws that Congress had passed. The South was occupied territory. In 1868, Johnston was due for a re-election. And, of course, he was a very lame duck. But the radicals weren't satisfied with waiting out his term of office. They saw a possibility of impeaching and removing him from office, and thus establishing what amounted to a cabinet form of government in the United States. Because the Constitution says a president or other federal officer may be impeached and convicted only for commission of high crimes or misdemeanors while in office. What the radicals were after was Johnson's scalp simply because he dared to oppose them politically. And they had a pretty good shot at doing it. And they tried to bring impeachment proceedings against Johnson, did so. The House impeached him. The Senate would have the trial in 1868. And it was a very close vote. The radicals, as I said, had two-thirds majorities in both houses, but not all the Republicans were willing to go along. It would have taken all the Democrats, who of course voted for Johnson, plus 7 Republicans to defeat the conviction. And you can imagine the arm twisting that went on with those 7 Republicans. Yet, those 7 held firm, and on 3 different votes, voted to acquit Johnson. And the rest of the proceedings were dropped. It's the closest we've ever had to have a president removed from office. It happened in, I think, in May of 1868. The hero of this was Senator James Lane of Kansas. You'll find his biography in President Kennedy's book, Profiles of Courage. Lane was elected from a territory which was clearly supporting the radicals, was a Republican, had only his conscience to stand between himself and voting for the impeachment of Johnson, but would not give in, even though he knew he would never be reelected and would never serve in the Senate again, which indeed came about. He faded into obscurity after the 1868 elections. But he managed to hold firm and do what his conscience told him was the right thing to do, and voted against the removal of Johnson from office. And so the attempt to create a congressional government that would overrule the executive and to make the executive subservient was defeated. And in the long term, that was one of the most significant things about the Reconstruction time. We're talking about Reconstruction from the political point of view. There also was Reconstruction from economic and social points of view. Economically, the South, as captured territory, offered a great opportunity to rebuild. Southern economy had been damaged almost beyond repair. Northern capital began to pour into the South. People like August Belmont, for example, invested widely in Southern coal and Southern steel resources, and Southern iron resources. Birmingham, which didn't exist during the Civil War, became one of the major steel centers of America, named after Birmingham, England, which also was a steel center. Together with these so-called carpetbaggers, Northerners who came south to make their fortunes, Southern whites who cooperated with them were known as Scalawags, and there is where we get the term carpetbagger and the Scalawag. And they attempted to rebuild the South, take advantage of the South's economic destitution to create profits for themselves and a new way of life for the South based on industry. At the same time, with the blacks voting in the South and the federal troops there to ensure that they would continue to be able to vote, state governments in the South changed radically. Before the war, the Southern state governments provided very, very little in the way of public services. There was no public education or hardly any public services, and of course there was hardly any debt. Now, With the new Reconstruction governments, public education was begun on a vast scale. Enormous amounts of money had to be spent. Enormous amounts of money were borrowed. Taxes were raised. And, of course, this was very unpopular with the ex-Confederate whites, especially because it was being carried out with the support of the Northern troops by Southern blacks. And so a movement began in the South to restrict the blacks from voting, however possible. One of the institutions which attempted to do this was the original Ku Klux Klan, which was founded more or less as a social club on Christmas Eve, 1865, in Pulaski, Tennessee. The couple of young ex-Confederate officers decided they'd have some fun. They dressed up in white sheets and invented all this Kliegels and Klans and all that kind of thing, and invented the name Ku Klux Klan. Nobody knows what it really means. One theory is that it may have been taken from the sound of the rifle being cocked. Another theory is that it derives from the Greek kuklos, meaning circle. But at any rate, they started it more or less as a parlor game until they found that they could intimidate blacks from voting with all this mummery. And so the Klan became an active agent in attempting to keep blacks from voting in the South. However, the masks also attracted a very bad element. And after a couple of years, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who himself had been a Confederate cavalry officer and before the war a slave trader, and who was the head of the Ku Klux Klan, disbanded the organization. It's not well known that the modern Klan has nothing to do with the original Ku Klux Klan. The modern Klan didn't serve us till the 20th century. And it is not specifically an anti-black organization. It hates everybody equally. At any rate, the economic reconstruction of the South went hand in hand with the social reconstruction, and that was a difference in the race relations between the two races. Now, in the South before the war, slavery had served not only as a labor system, but also as a system of race relations. After the war, slavery was no longer there. There was no more slavery to control race relations, and the black codes were overruled by the new governments. For approximately 25 years after the end of the war, there was not what we now think of as Jim Crow in the South. The rigid segregation laws, separation of the races, and eating facilities and transportation facilities, none of this was in effect immediately after the war or in the Reconstruction period. It wasn't until much later in the century, to the 1890s, that all those Jim Crow laws were passed. In the immediate post-war period, the method of social control was largely economic, and it had to do with the land. When the North had conquered the land and the Freedmen's Bureau was set up and the blacks were given civil rights under the 14th Amendment, one thing was not done. There was no massive land confiscation from planters to give every black farmer 40 acres and a mule, as they thought they were going to get, and many urged that they should get. Confiscation was just too radical for the U.S. Congress to go along with. And so you were left with a situation where the whites held the land, but not the means to work it. The blacks had the labor, but not the land. And so they entered into agreements, frequently sharecropping agreements, in which the black would provide the labor, the white landowner, or who also became a storekeeper, would provide the seed, the tools, and whatever in exchange for a share of the crop. The trouble with this was that the black worker became almost a serf because he could never get out of debt. Every year when he brought in his crop, the best he could do was pay off last year's debt and then go into debt again for next year. And this left him utterly in the power of the landowner and storekeeper, to whom he was perpetually in debt. And if the landowner said, "Don't you dare vote in the next election, or I will throw you off the land," what's the sharecropper supposed to do? So the blacks in the South went from slavery to a kind of informal serfdom based on the fact that they had no land and couldn't do anything else. There wasn't really, had no skills to do anything else and very little education. Meanwhile, in the North, after the war, while Reconstruction was going on in the South, the North was experiencing binge years. In American history, we have had a series of cycles over and over again between periods of intense reform, culminating in cataclysm, followed by a period of moral relaxation. And you see it over and over again. You see it at this particular time when the period of moral reform built up from 1830 to 1860, ending in the cataclysm of the war, which did destroy slavery, although it didn't do all the things that might have been done to make the former slaves equal citizens. But after the war, in the North, with the fighting behind, the enormous cost, the strain behind, people weren't interested in moral reform anymore. What people wanted was to be left alone to have a good time and make money for themselves. And this is the period Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner called the Gilded Age in the North. This is the period in which speculators such as Jay Gould and Jim Fisk and Daniel Drew, speculating in railroad stocks, ruined thousands of people, but made huge fortunes for themselves. Gould even tried to corner the gold market with the aid of the Secretary of Treasury in Grant's administration, who was a none too honest man himself by the name of Albert G. Boutwell. Grant was elected in 1868, and his administration was one scandal after another, Grant having very little personal interest in government and no sense whatsoever of who to appoint. He had absolutely no sense of who was an honest person and who wasn't, was easily duped, and as a result presided over 8 years of corruption in high places unlike anything we'd ever seen before and probably since. The Grant administration really was one of the worst in American history. In the North was a time for making money and making it wholesale and none too honestly. It was also a time when the Congress restored the gold standard. During the war, of course, the gold standard had been relieved. Greenbacks had been used to help finance the war effort to make easier money. But after the war, the United States went back on the gold standard, and this had enormous effects because it squeezed a growing economy. After all, the economy was expanding extremely rapidly with the growth of the Civil War demand and the iron and steel industry, clothing, food, all these huge packing, meat packing, all these huge industries began to grow up on a nationwide basis, and they needed enormous financing to support them. And at the same time, the money supply was artificially constricted to get out of the ground. When you think of it, the gold standard is so insane, so nonsensical, as to be bewildering to any rational person when you think about what it is. Because what it says is the amount of money in society can only be limited to how much gold you can dig out of the ground and put back under the ground in Fort Knox. Now, does this make sense? But it makes sense to hard money people, people who are owed debts. In other words, the gold standard is the banker's best friend because it means that he gets paid back in money that's worth as much or more than it was at the time he lent the money. The gold standard is also the poor man's, the borrower's, greatest enemy because it means that he doesn't have the aid of inflation to pay back money at a lower value than at which he borrowed it. And the gold standard put an enormous squeeze on the economy, caused a depression in 1873, and in fact caused a period of about 20 years of depression, helped cause about 20 years of depression from 1865 to roughly, or 1870 roughly, to about 1890. At the same time that the gold standard was squeezing the money supply, and particularly squeezing the debtor farmer, another factor came about which caused the farmers great distress. Huge new territories of land were opened up to cultivation after the Civil War, and in fact during the war and after the war. Kansas entered the Union in 1861, Nebraska in 1867, the Dakota territories were settled, and enormous new growing lands, particularly devoted to wheat, were brought into cultivation. Immediately, with its enormous increase in the wheat supply, the supply began to exceed the demand. And that, of course, means that the price went down. However, all those farmers out on the plains didn't understand that what was happening was a world economic factor, whereas the world demand for wheat was not going up as fast as the world supply of wheat. All they could see was that they were being squeezed by the bankers and the railroads. And that's who they thought was responsible. And they became politically active as the populists. The populists were basically one-crop farmers, cotton farmers in the South and wheat farmers in the West. And they attempted to redress what they saw as their condition by legislation, particularly regulation of railroads, grain elevators, and banks. The Supreme Court of the United States, however, took the 14th Amendment, which was intended in the original incarnation to protect the civil rights of the South. And they took particularly the phrase that says, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, the Due Process Clause. The word person was interpreted to mean a corporate person as well as a human being. And you may not know, but the fact is that a corporation is a person as far as the law is concerned. For example, you take the XYZ Corporation, it is as much a person as George Sloan or me, sitting here talking about this history. And it has the same rights as an individual would have before the law. And so the Supreme Court took the Due Process Clause and interpreted it to protect corporations from legislation or regulation by the state governments and the federal government, particularly the state governments. Forgetting all about the condition of blacks in the South, who nobody cared about very much after a few years passed after the end of the war. And so while the blacks in the South sunk to semi-serf status, corporations were protected from regulation by a Supreme Court much more interested in northern business than in southern black rights. All this came to a head in 1876. And the election of 1876 was one of the most controversial we've ever had. By this time, all but 3 of the southern states had rejoined the Union, and there were only federal troops left in 3 of the southern states. The Democratic candidate in 1876 was Samuel Tilden, who was a reform governor of New York and who had a very good reputation as an honest businessman and an honest public official. The Republican candidate, Grant having been allowed to leave the White House gracefully, even though he thought he wanted a 3rd term, they told him absolutely no. The Republican candidate was Rutherford B Hayes, who had followed Grant as a Union officer from Ohio, and in fact followed the pattern of Republican candidates after the war. Every Republican candidate for years after the war had been a Union officer, and many of them came from Ohio and Indiana. Well, Hayes is a candidate from Ohio, and not a particularly distinguished man, although he looked very distinguished and had some ability. But at any rate, Hayes was the Republican candidate against Tilden. And when the election was held, Tilden won a majority of the popular vote and was 1 electoral vote short of victory. 20 electoral votes were in dispute in Oregon and in the 3 southern states where the troops were still in force. Hayes would have to have all 20 of those electoral votes to become president. Tilden only needed 1. The electoral votes were disputed, and Congress could not decide how to apportion them. March 4th was Inauguration Day. There had to be a president inaugurated on March 4th. Something had to be done to decide who was going to be president. So Congress appointed an Electoral Commission. The commission consisted of 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and was supposed to include a Justice of the United States, David Davis, who was supposed to be the swing vote and who was a moderate and not political. But Judge Davis resigned, and instead he was replaced by another Republican on the Electoral Commission. And so when the commission voted, it gave every one of those disputed electoral votes to Hayes, and Hayes was elected president. In exchange, however, Hayes had promised to pull the last federal troops out of the South and allow the white Southerners to control the remaining southern states. This was the great bargain of 1876. The Republicans, in other words, took the White House in exchange for the Democrats controlling the remaining southern states and for pulling the federal troops out of the South and allowing the South to re-enter the Union, the remaining southern states to re-enter the Union. And so that bargain led to what for the next 75 years was the solid Democratic South. No Republican could ever get elected anywhere in the South. And it also led to the continuing Republican control of the White House for another 25 or 30 years. No Democrat could be elected president until 1884, until 1884, and then only 1 Democrat was elected between 1865 and 1912. So the Republicans, in other words, got control of the White House and got control of the federal government. The Democrats got control of the southern states and control of race relations in the South as well. After 1876, the Depression continued, the Farm Depression. The populists attempted to elect presidents, and in fact they nominated William Jennings Bryan, the orator from the boy orator of the Platte, they called him, the silver-tongued orator of the Platte. The populists joined forces with the Free Silver people in Colorado, where silver mining was a big industry, and the Free Silver people simply wanted the government to continue coining silver at the rate of 16 to 1 with gold. In other words, 16 silver coins for every gold coin. This, again, was a form of easier money. And it was opposed by the gold bugs, the hard money people in the government. And in 1893, was it? The hard money people won, and they achieved the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Silver was demonetized, and the gold standard reigned high. The ironic thing about this is that just at this time, enormous new gold discoveries were made in South Africa, in Colorado, and in Canada. Within 5 years, huge new gold supplies were brought in, and all of a sudden, with more gold available, the money supply didn't pinch nearly as much. And so going on the gold standard with the demonetization of silver in 1893 did not hurt the economy nearly as much as could have been expected. Once again, you see how world affairs affect American economic affairs in this case. The gold discoveries in South Africa, which is still the world's largest gold producer, had an enormous effect on the American economy. I would imagine that probably not 1 in 100 Americans ever had any idea that that was happening. But the discovery of gold in South Africa had an enormous effect. During all this time, the period after the Civil War, the North was able to do something, the Northern industrialists were able to do something that they had wanted to do all along and had never been able to do. For many years before the war, the North, with its the Northern economy, with its industrial base, had wanted an economic program from the federal government that would be suitable for its support. It wanted high tariffs to protect American producers from foreign competition. It wanted subsidies for internal improvements for the construction of railways and waterways, and it wanted more land for the land grants for the colleges, to found colleges, and it wanted land grants for homesteaders who wanted to move to the West. When the Southern states seceded, it allowed the Congress, which was then dominated by the Republican Party, to pass that Northern economic program. And so during the Civil War, some of the most significant legislation that was passed had nothing whatsoever to do with the fighting. The Pacific Railroad Act was passed, which granted subsidies from $16,000 to $48,000 a mile, plus land subsidies, for the construction of the Pacific Railway, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, to the Pacific Coast, from California to Nebraska, Omaha. The Land Grant College Act was passed, which gave the states federal lands which they could use to sell to support the creation of colleges, which would specialize in agricultural and mechanical engineering, turn out engineers for industry and for agriculture, and military science, of course, with the war at hand. The first of these was Michigan State University, then called Michigan A&M. Many states today have a university called, for example, Michigan State, Colorado State, Oklahoma State. In addition to the state university, the University of Michigan, the University of Oklahoma, the University of Colorado University. Those state schools generally were A&Ms, some still are, Texas A&M notably, and they're all land-grant colleges. And they were founded as a result of the Land Grant College Act passed by the Republican Party during the Civil War. Third thing, the high tariff. The South, which of course dealt in trade of cotton to Europe for goods, always favored low tariffs and was able to block tariff reform in the Congress. But when the Southern states seceded, one of the first things the Northerners did was to pass a high tariff on imported goods to protect Northern industrial producers. And the high tariff, of course, caused an additional burden on the South. The South remained the section of the country that had to import most of its finished goods, and whether they imported them from Europe or from the North, the high tariff hurt the South economically. And fourthly, the North passed the Homestead Act. This was the payoff to the working man for all these subsidies to business. The working man was told that if he cared to go to the federal lands in the West and squat on a piece of land and work it for 5 years and build a house, he could own that land all by himself, free. Vote yourself a farm was the Republican slogan. Well, not a great many people did homestead. Most of the land that was available homesteading wasn't very good because the best lands were being used as subsidies for the colleges and the railroads. And even when you could homestead, it wasn't a very desirable life. But with the low wheat price and the weather and the lack of water on the plains and the locusts and the living conditions was very hard. And not a great many people did actually homestead. But the idea that you could homestead, that you could, if you wanted to improve your life, you had another alternative. You could always quit your job and move west, was a very important factor in making Northern working people a lot happier than they might otherwise have been at the time when business was expanding so rapidly. Another thing that the Northerners did at this time was to buy Alaska. The Secretary of State in Lincoln's administration was Secretary William Seward. And even after Lincoln was assassinated, Seward continued in office under Johnston. And in 1867, he agreed with the Tsar of Russia to purchase Alaska for $7.2 million, or approximately 2 cents an acre. It was called Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox at the time, but today it is so incredibly wealthy in natural resources and so important from the strategic point of view that if we hadn't made Seward's folly, the United States would be much less of a great nation today than it otherwise is. Imagine if the Soviet Union owned Alaska and extended almost to the northern boundary of the United States. And that would have happened had the purchase not been made in 1867. In fact, the oil resources, the timber resources, and the gold resources of Alaska alone have been worth thousands of times the purchase price, and in the future will be worth thousands more times the purchase price. The great event economically of this period was the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was to the 19th century what the moon landings were in the 20th century, and it was symbolized the transcontinental nation, the transcontinental nationhood of the United States. It was finished in 1869 after roughly 3.5 years of construction. It was a terribly difficult job, and it also served to provide a great number of jobs for former soldiers who were released from the Army. Many of them went to work on the railroad. Even with those working people, there wasn't enough labor to build the line. And so Charles Crocker, who was in charge of construction for the Central Pacific, the western part of the line, building east from California toward Nevada, sent to China for labor. At first, the Chinese were not very popular. Nobody liked them. But Crocker noticed that the Chinese would work extremely hard, that they didn't eat very much, they drank less than they ate, they didn't brawl, they didn't fight, they accepted a wage of whatever cents a day, and they kept coming back for more. They were ideal workmen. And so Crocker kept sending ships back to China, send me more Chinese. And Central Pacific and many other projects in the West were built largely with Chinese labor, and it's the origin of the great Chinatown in San Francisco today. The Chinese who were imported to work on the Pacific Railway by Charles Crocker and his associates. So by 1876 or so, the face of the country had been changed. With the railroads came demand, and with industrialization came more demand for coal. Mining became a major industry. Coal mining became the fundamental industry, where coal was to the 19th century what oil was. Coal was the black gold that made the wheels go round. It was the principal energy source. Mining conditions were frequently terrible, and coal mining was the most hazardous job in America. Many of the people who did the mining in places like the anthracite mines of Pennsylvania were Irishmen. The Irish were the great labor supply in the East, in addition to the Chinese in the West. The Irish, who came in floods after the potato famine of 1848, millions of Irish came to America, and they were at the bottom of the scale. First of all, they were Catholics. And the United States at that time was still an overwhelmingly Protestant country, and there was a great prejudice against Catholics. Secondly, many of the Irish were uneducated, and the stereotype of the brawling Saturday night Irishman with his brogue is still among us. You still hear that stereotype. As a matter of fact, the Irish have, as a group, done very well in America and risen very high. But no Irish need apply was what you saw when you'd see a Help Wanted sign in some places in the East when they first started to come. It would say Help Wanted, and underneath it would say No Irish Need Apply. The Irish have made their mark, however, and they were the great labor supply in the unskilled industries after the war. It was also a time when the rapid expansion of the economy and the enormous expansion in the population made it necessary to provide more and more labor-saving devices, because the labor supply could never keep up with the demand of the expanding economy. With all the immigrants who came to this country, and many thousands and millions did, the United States has always been, and still is, labor short. The basic fact of the American economy as compared with European economies has always been that in the United States, the amount of land as compared with the size of the population is enormous. The population density is very, very light, except in places like New York City, for example. But overall, in the country as a whole, the land-labor ratio is much more land to every person than there is in Europe. In Europe, it's the other way around. There's a much greater population than, relative to the available land supply. So the land-labor ratio drives wages down in Europe, whereas the land-labor ratio in America makes the United States chronically short of labor and drives wages up. That's why, to this day, immigrants come to the United States seeking a better life and often find it. because they can make more money here than they can make in their own countries, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, or whether it's, as today it's in Latin America, where the immigration has come from. The United States has been a magnet, drawing people from all over the world. First from Northern Europe, from Britain and Scotland and Wales, later from Scandinavia, then from Germany and Ireland, then from Southern Europe, from Italy, from Poland, from Yugoslavia, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, from Russia, then also from Asia, from Japan, and to a much smaller degree, and then from a much greater degree, China, today from Vietnam, from Thailand, from Singapore, and now from South America, and notably from Mexico and from El Salvador. People from all over the world have come to the United States to add their labor in hopes for a better life in this country. And who can say that immigration hasn't been the strength of the United States, looking at the history of the country? Where would we be without the immigrants? Certainly would not have the great national economy that you have today, or national international economy, and the great high standard of living we've had. Well, I was talking about labor-saving devices. Among the great inventions of the period during and after the war, the reaper, the harvester, was necessary because all the men had gone to war. How could you harvest the crops without mechanical aid? And so Cyrus McCormick was successful in building reapers, started what became the International Harvester Company with a great farm machinery implement. John Deere invented the plow, the steel-edged plow that could cut the hard soil of the plains and bring that land into cultivation. Thomas Edison, so many of his inventions, perhaps the most important was the incandescent electric light bulb in 1879, for reasons which I'll talk about in a little while. He also invented, among other things, the movie camera and the stock ticker and thousands of others. He had more patents, I think, than anybody in history. Alexander Graham Bell, who was a teacher of the deaf, experimented with the telephone and succeeded in creating telephone conversations in 1876. Bigger and more powerful engines were built. Electricity became a prime mover, prime source of power, not only for lighting but also for mechanical power, and began to replace steam power. Or in other words, to centralize steam power in power plants and distribute the power through electric lines to the source of where it was used. This meant a huge expansion in the copper industry because copper wire became extremely essential. And beginning in about 1895 to 1900, enormous copper mines were developed in the United States, in Utah and in Arizona. The Guggenheim family became famous in the copper mining business. Charles Tutt, that's right. Spencer Penrose, Utah Copper, Utah Consolidated Copper. Iron and steel. Steel was introduced after the war. When you hear about steel during the Civil War, it's not true. There was no steel during the Civil War. Steel was introduced by an Englishman, Sir Henry Bessemer, in 1866. And the Bessemer process was brought to America, supplemented by the open hearth process invented somewhat later. All these processes were designed to turn iron, which was, of course, malleable and bendable, into a much tougher material, steel. Steel found its basic uses in building rails, making rails, and in building skyscrapers. In the 19th century, the skyscraper was invented. Before the steel frame building up meant building enormous blocks of stone to support all that weight. The steel frame building was not only stronger, it was also more flexible. It didn't fall down in earthquakes, and it was much cheaper to build. The steel frame skyscraper is an American invention, and it first appeared in Chicago in, I think, 1890-something. Another of the great developments after the war. Meat packing. On the frontier, there were hundreds and thousands of cattle. The problem was how to get the meat to the market. The expansion of the railroads west from the Missouri River after the war gave the opportunity, and the long cattle drives from Texas up to Kansas and the railhead began. The longhorn cattle would be driven north for 1,000 miles by these cowboys and loaded onto rail cars and shipped to the nearest packing center, which was Chicago, where the cattle would be turned into beef and the hogs into pork and shipped to the major markets in the east. Then the development of the refrigerator car made it possible to ship dressed meat rather than live cattle. And with that development, the availability of meat increased enormously. The cattle drives were no longer necessary. Slaughtering could be done closer to the range, and the stockyards today are not in Chicago at all. Nobody even there aren't any more stockyards in Chicago. All the major stockyards are further west. Omaha has one, Fort Worth, Texas, places you wouldn't think of. But at any rate, the development of the refrigerator car made meat more available and cheaper. One of the other things that happened on the frontier was mining. As I mentioned, the gold standard made gold extremely desirable, and silver was also valuable until 1893. And so one of the first things that happened on the frontier was people went out to find rich metals, to find precious metals. The biggest strike was in Nevada in 1859, the Comstock Lode, the most amazing mining find ever in the United States, which has produced billions in gold and silver, over $1 billion in gold and silver in 1800 values. So important was the Comstock that Nevada was admitted to the Union as a state in 1864, even though it didn't have anywhere near the required number of people. In fact, what was admitted was one mountain, Mount Davidson or Sun Mountain in Nevada, Virginia City, Nevada, where all that gold and silver was coming from. And up until just the last 15 years or so, Nevada was the smallest population state in the Union, even now. But the Comstock Lode helped finance the construction of San Francisco. Almost all the major institutions in San Francisco were financed by Comstock gold, including the hotels and those beautiful Victorian houses and the major banks. Many of them were Comstock funds. And also the Comstock helped finance the Union war effort by supplying not only money but credit to the Union government to finance the war effort. After the war, further strikes were made in Colorado. Even before the war, there was one at Gregory Gulch near Denver, but it was a short-lived one. But later on, Central City, Colorado, and then Leadville, and then last, the greatest of all, the gold booms, Cripple Creek in 1891. So mining began to take place on the frontier. Also in South Dakota, the Homestead mine in Deadwood, South Dakota, is still America's biggest gold producer. And in Alaska, and in Canada, the Klondike Rush of 1898. The frontier, in other words, began to be pushed back by the miners and the cattlemen, and later by the farmers. In 1890, the census of 1890 made a statement that there was no longer a discernible frontier of settlement. Before the war, you could say that settlement stopped at the Missouri River, and then you could say that settlement stopped at the Rocky Mountains. But in 1890, there was no longer a discernible frontier. This had also involved Indian fighting, serious Indian fighting, after the war and even during the Civil War. The Shivington Massacre of 1864 killed many, many Indians. The Indians got their revenge in 1876 at Custer's last stand, but it was really the Indians' last stand. It was one of the great Pyrrhic victories in history because the Indians could never again muster that kind of a force. And Geronimo surrendered in 1886. He was the last of the great war chiefs to fight the U.S. government. The last battle was the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890 in South Dakota, the result of the ghost dance craze, the Indian revival movement. The revivalists said that, believed that if they danced the ghost dance, the great leaders would come back and the whites could no longer hurt them, and they found out, unfortunately, differently. After 1890, there was no longer any Indian fighting, and the frontier was closed. In 1893, at the World's Colombian Exposition in Chicago, which was held to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery, except they missed by a year. They weren't ready in 1892. It had to be held in 1893. It was the great party of the last part of the 19th century, and it celebrated a number of things, among which was the end of that long period of depression. The gay 90s were gay, among other reasons, because there was enough money to go around. People were living better. But anyway, at the convention of the American Historical Association, which met in Chicago in 1893, connected with the World's Columbian Exposition, Frederick Jackson Turner, who was a rather obscure professor of history at the University of Wisconsin at that time, delivered an address in which he said that the source of the American character, the distinctive American character, with its optimism, its emphasis on freedom, its emphasis on the rule of law, and all the other characteristics that we like to think of as American, derived, in his opinion, not so much from institutions brought from Europe as from the presence of the frontier, the availability of free land on the western frontier of the country. And he said that with the announcement that the frontier was closed, the first great era in American history, the shaping of American character, has ended. Turner's thesis is probably the most significant individual contribution any historian ever made to understanding American life. And whether or not you agree with it, and many historians agree with it, and many historians disagree with it, it's been debated and argued over for 100 years now, it's still a fundamental theory of American history. While all this was going on, you should not believe that all was sweetness and light in the country. As immigration continued, there were certainly anti-immigration riots, people who didn't like new immigrants coming in, not only for the fact that they were labor competition, but because they were different. For heaven's sake, some of them didn't speak English. And there was something called the Native American movement back in the 1840s even, when the Irish were coming in large numbers. There were anti-Catholic riots in Baltimore, Maryland. If I'm not mistaken, a convent was burned, and then nuns were abused and hanged. Terrible things happened. And this nativist tide is still with us today, although not nearly as pronounced and as loud as it was then. Also, much more important really, the rise of great national industry provoked a response. Huge national corporations with enormous economic power were unknown and undreamed of before the Civil War. After the Civil War, they were a fact of life. And so one-sided was the economic equation that the individual working man had virtually no power whatsoever. He could quit his job, but if he did, somebody else was there to take his job, and then he was out of a job and had no recourse. So labor began to organize. Labor unions came into existence. The first ones weren't very powerful or very successful. But in 1877, there was a national railroad strike, which began when the railroad companies unilaterally cut wages, and the workers went on strike. And there was violence. The station in Pittsburgh was burned, there was rioting, people were killed, the National Guard had to be called out, and it was a shock to people. People in America had never heard of such a thing as organized labor violence and organized labor strikes. Immediately, the popular opinion was very much anti-labor and very much pro-capital. But this did not remain necessarily that way, as more and more people began to see the powerlessness of labor as compared to capital. There were other major strikes of national importance: Homestead and the steel industry in 1892, the Pullman Strike in 1894. Coxey's Army of the Unemployed the same year marched on Washington asking for help. The labor organized to seek the 8-hour day in 1886, and it resulted in a riot in Chicago, the Haymarket Riot, in which a number of people were killed, including a number of policemen, by a bomb that was thrown by an unidentified person. Nobody knew who threw the bomb, but the authorities decided somebody had to pay for this, and they arrested 7 anarchists against whom there was virtually no evidence. They were convicted. A couple of them, I think 4 of them, were hanged. 1 died, and the other 2 were eventually pardoned because there wasn't really any evidence against them. But it was this, again, anti-labor hysteria and violence in 1886. I mentioned the anthracite industry and the terrible conditions there and the fact that many of the miners were Irishmen. Well, in 1877, the Irish in the Pennsylvania anthracite fields organized against their bosses, and they took the name of the Irish land reformers in their home country, the Molly Maguires. You may have seen a movie with Richard Burton some years ago called The Molly Maguires. It's based on the true story of the Irish in Pennsylvania who organized to combat by violent means if necessary the bosses in the coal industry. They too were broken up and many were hanged. But the fact is that all across America there was a new consciousness of the need for labor to assert itself, to organize, and to protect its rights. The movement that the populists had engendered towards reform by legislation was now supported by labor as well. And the first great federal regulation of industry was the Interstate Commerce Act, passed in 1887 and directed to control abuses in the railroads. The railroads were the first great national industry, and it's appropriate enough that they were the first to be put under regulation in 1887. The Interstate Commerce Act, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission, is very controversial in American history. At the time, it was hailed as a great step forward, and in fact, probably until the last 20 years, opinion about it was basically favorable. But a number of economists in the 20th century writing today have asserted that the Interstate Commerce Commission has cost the consumer enormous amounts of money. And in fact, it's very interesting because the hand-in-hand relationship between industries and the commissions that regulate them has been pointed out more than once in the 20th century. In some ways, the regulation is favorable to the industry that it's supposed to control. It certainly wasn't the case of the Interstate Commerce Commission, because what the ICC did was to determine the power to decide who gets into the railroad business, what new lines could be built and which could not be built. And the Commission has had a tendency over the years to prevent the construction of new lines that would compete with existing corporations, and to prevent the concentration of traffic on any particular line so as to keep a maximum amount of miles operating. Unfortunately, this also causes a maximum amount of debt and a maximum amount of cost to the consumer because it prevents efficient consolidations. So the argument against the ICC today is as strong as the argument was for it back in the 19th century. And so we approach the end of the 19th century. The period of 30 years or so from the end of the Civil War until the roughly 1895 was a period of enormous economic development in the North, economic struggle with the Depression in the farm frontier, and in the South, which was impoverished so much by the war and by Reconstruction that to this day it is still the poorest section of the country and has never recovered, even despite all the industry that has moved there and the changes in the 20th century. And also it is the time in which America achieved its continental maximum, its continental destiny. The frontier disappeared. The Indians were broken, their power broken, and they were put on the reservations. And the modern nation, the nation of the United States that we recognize today, came into being. And we'll talk next about the next step, what happened after the 19th century when the United States became an international power, a world country, world power, as well as a national one.